Hi folks, Landwehr infantry today for my Prussian army of 1813. If you've seen my other videos for this collection, you'll know the deal by now. A traditional base, shade, highlight approach aiming for a high tabletop standard using the Citadel paint range. Figures today are the ever wonderful Peri Metals in 28mm, available wearing the regular Schirmütze or with a wire stiffened cap. But for a couple of alternatives, you could also try in metal, either the front rank or Calpe ranges, both available now through Gripping Beast, or in plastic, the set from Warlord Games. Not the most popular sculpts I know, but if you wait until one of their sprue sales comes around, you can pick up a bunch of them for fairly cheap. Quicker to paint too, but more on that to follow. Whereas previously I've done separate uniformology and painting videos, the Landwehr are a little more straightforward, so to keep things moving along with the series, I'm combining both into the one video. So, to begin, prime your figure in black, then take the following colours for your base coats: Cantor Blue, Rakarth Flesh, Dawnstone, Abaddon Black, Mephiston Red, Dryad Bark, Steel Legion Drab, Leadbelcher, Balthazar Gold, Cadian Flesh Tone, a mix of suitable hair colours, I'm using Baneblade Brown for this figure, the correct facing colour from the list on screen, according to the regiment's provincial designation. Note, by the way, these are different in a few cases to the colours worn by line and reserve regiments from the same province, and another colour for the shoulder straps, the exact use of which, to distinguish either battalion or regimental seniority, differed depending on the province in which it was raised. I'll expand on both of these distinctions when we get to that stage in the model. Starting off, in Cantor Blue, paint the long coat or Litevka. These appeared in a wide range of patterns, with either one or two rows of buttons, several different cuff designs, and in varying lengths, oftentimes simply as a result of the men cutting bits off to patch up repairs. Very occasionally you'll encounter different colours used as well, like the 3rd Silesian Regiment, who wore a brown Litevka. Still in Cantor Blue, paint the body of the cap, or Schirmütze, as well. Again, this was by far the most common option, although some regiments received British light infantry shakos instead, like the 2nd Silesian Regiment. Rakarth Flesh next. Paint over the trousers, which were this simple white linen affair for most of the men, as well as the canvas knapsack, its straps across the body, and, on sculpts that include it, the haversack as well. To give your units a more ragtag appearance, you may want to paint some trousers in different colours also. Ones in grey and blue are sometimes mentioned, for instance. Where possible, the knapsacks were replaced with ones made from calfskin, either in the Prussian design worn by the line infantry, or captured French ones, but none of the Peri sculpts is equipped with these. Okay, on to Dawnstone. This is only needed for sculpts that are wearing a great coat roll worn across the body, as seen on this other model I've swapped to for the clip. Carefully, in Abaddon Black, pick out the thick leather strap for the cartridge pouch, worn diagonally across the torso, as well as the body of the pouch itself, and the peak of the Schirmütze. If your model's wearing boots, you'll also want to paint those in black. Some of the sculpts have a leather strap on the back of the musket. I've seen various colours used in illustrations for these. Personally, I've gone for Mephiston Red here, like the red leather strap seen on the line infantry, but I've also seen them in white or off-white, so take your pick. Then, using Dryad Bark, paint the wooden stock and body of the musket, and, if sculpted with one, the haft of the axe. This was worn on the opposite hip to the cartridge pouch. Wooden clogs were apparently a common sight among Landwehr, especially in mid-1813. I use Steel Legion Drab as a base coat for any sculpts wearing those. Metals are up next. Using Leadbelcher, paint the barrel, lock and bayonet on the musket, and the cross, or Landwehrkreuz, on the Schirmütze. If your sculpt has one, then paint the axe head in Leadbelcher too, and for regiments raised in East Prussia, West Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia or Westphalia, the buttons on the Litevka. For regiments raised in the other provinces, paint the buttons instead using Balthazar Gold. You'll also want this colour for the bands connecting the barrel to the body of the musket. In Cadian Flesh Tone, go over all the skin on the face, neck and hands, being careful also to check for sculpts with bare feet, or with exposed ankles in the case of those wearing clogs. Then pick your hair colour of choice. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm using Baneblade Brown for today's figure. Right, facings. The colour is based on the province where the regiment was raised. The exact translation of each colour varies a bit between sources, so for consistency with my other videos in the series, I've gone back to Richard Knörtel's Handbuch der Uniformkunde as my main source here. East Prussia is the brick red colour that we often see used for its line infantry, sometimes translated as orange red instead. You'll see quite a few different shades of red used in illustrations for this, confusion I think stemming from the use of brick red for a much darker tone in relation to British uniforms. If you'd like a bit more detail on some comparisons between these different reds, then I go through that in my video on Prussian unit facings, linked in the corner of the screen now. For Kurmark and Neumark, Knörtel lists them as simply red. Hofschurer calls it poppy red, which ties up quite nicely with the facing colour used by the Leipzig Regiment and the 12th or 2nd Brandenburg Regiment, I think. More closely than does the label of brick red, as chosen by Nash and Summerfield. West Prussia, oddly, is in black, instead of the crimson of their line regiments. Pomerania is in white, and Silesia in yellow. For the newer regiments, Westphalia is a simple green. Rhineland, whose regiments weren't raised until 1815, are in Krapprot, or Madder red, a fairly deep pink or blood red colour. Corn red perhaps would be a good choice as a base coat here. And, for the Elbe district, a light blue. With the colour in hand, paint the tall collar on the Litewka and the band running around the Schirmütze. For some regiments, the whole of the cuff is in this colour as well, whereas for others, it's just the inside edge that's piped in the facing colour. Given how thin it would end up being, I haven't painted on that piping for these figures, but you can if you'd like. In some illustrations, you'll also see piping in facing colour around the top of the crown of the Schirmütze, and in a sort of chevron decoration on the front and sides of the cap, called Stegen. This was formally introduced by an AKO dated 31st of May 1814. Although, as Summerfield notes, the same design can already be seen in illustrations dating from 1813, so it's up to you if you want to add that detail or not. While we're talking about the Schirmütze, many regiments also featured a small black and white cockade on the centre, or more rarely the side of the band. This isn't modelled on the Perry figures, but it is on the Warlord game sculpts, along with a faint outline of those Stegen decorations. Okay, last detail. Shoulder straps. Some regiments, namely those raised in East Prussia, West Prussia, Elbe and Westphalia, followed the same practice as the line and reserve infantry, of using shoulder straps to denote regimental seniority within a province. So, all battalions in the 1st West Prussian Regiment, for instance, would have white shoulder straps. Those in the 2nd Regiment would have red, in the 3rd, yellow, in the 4th, blue, and, for East Prussia, the 5th, white. The regimental number was also embroidered onto this in a contrasting colour. Landwehr, raised in the Rhineland, seem to have used just the facing colour on all shoulder straps, so stick with the same colour you used for their collar and cap band. The ones from Kurmark, Neumark, Pomerania and Silesia, however, differed from the line in using the shoulder straps for battalion seniority instead. So, per the table on screen, soldiers in the 3rd Battalion of their regiment would have yellow shoulder straps, irrespective of how their regiment itself is numbered. The figure I'm painting is part of the 1st Battalion of the 9th Silesian Regiment, so white shoulder straps it is. There, tricky part out the way. Using Agrax Earthshade, I cover the entire model from top to bottom and set it aside to dry. This is where, depending on the number of figures you have to paint and your level of sanity, you might just say enough is enough and leave it there. At this natural break in proceedings, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of you who've shown your appreciation and support for the channel, whether that's with comments, likes, or subscribing. Videos like this aren't quick to produce, with about 45 clips totaling 50 gigs of footage to edit together just for this one guide, so your support is much appreciated. Right, let's press on, shall we? With the shade all dried, this is how he looks. For your midtones and highlights, you will need Cantor Blue, Altdorf Blue, Rakarth Flesh, Ulthuan Grey, Dawnstone, Administratum Grey, Eschin Grey, Gorthor Brown, Baylor Brown, Runefang Steel, Runelord Brass, Cadian Flesh Tone, Kislev Flesh, a suitable highlight for your chosen hair colour, and the corresponding colours for the facing and shoulder straps of your battalion. Starting with Cantor Blue, begin to reinforce the mid-tone on the Litewka, leaving the darker patches in the recesses and shadows. Then, with Altdorf Guard Blue, apply a thin edge highlight to places like the creases and folds in the fabric. Similarly, with Rakarth Flesh, I go over the fabric of the trousers and knapsack again, except for where the fabric would naturally be in shade. No edge highlight here. Instead, we go on to Ulthuan Grey, which I use for white straps on the knapsack, and in the case of anyone with a greatcoat, the tie fastening its ends. For the greatcoat itself, bring up the midtones, first in Dawnstone, and then highlight the creases in Administratum Grey. Anything in black receives an edge highlight in Eschin Grey, so that's the cartridge pouch, its strap, the edge of the peak of his cap, and the boots, if sculpted with them. For darker woods I use Gawthor Brown, again just an edge highlight, on the musket and the handle of the axe. And for the clogs, I do a 50-50 mix of Baylor Brown and Gawthor Brown. I tried a few different colours before landing on this, to get the right kind of worn look on the lighter shade of wood that you tend to see used for clogs. I use Runefang Steel for anything I painted in Lead Belcher earlier, so that's the barrel, lock, bayonet, buttons, Landwehrkreuz, and the axe head. And Runelord Brass for the bands on the musket, plus, depending on your regiment, the buttons. The first colour for the skin is Cadian Flesh Tone again, working here on the nose, upper cheeks, and most of the hand, leaving the shade between the fingers. Then, in Kislev Flesh, pick out the raised edges. Find a colour that's one shade lighter than the base coat for your hair. I base coated mine in Baneblade Brown, so I'm using Karak Stone as a highlight. Right, back to facings. Not as much to explain this time. Same table as before, just pick the right highlight colour, shown from the list across the bottom of the screen. For Silesia, I'm using Uriel Yellow to highlight a thin strip around the collar and the band on the Schirmütze. And it's the same process for the shoulder straps. The same table, highlight colour to match. In the case of Rhineland regions, I'd say perhaps a mix of Evil Sun Scarlet with Corn Red. Mine would be white for this figure, so Ulthuan Grey it is. Last, if you're feeling enthusiastic, you may want to try painting in the eyes. I'd normally only bother with this for command figures, but since they're sculpted so clearly on this model, and it is going to be on the thumbnail, I thought, why not? I use Ulthuan Grey for the whites of the eyes, and then draw a thin mark in Abaddon Black for the pupil. I found it's best to pull the brush down across the eye to do this, touching up the skin tone around it afterwards. So there we have our finished figure. I must say I'm a huge fan of these sculpts. They're really characterful, without being too detailed to the point that it becomes laborious to paint them. Here's a quick low-budget 360 of our finished figure. No expense spared here. And here he is next to a bunch of the other sculpts from the set. You can see the mix of those with greatcoats and without, the one in bare feet, the one with gaiters over his trousers, and a variety of different styles of Litewka. There's also, of course, a command pack for the battalion that you can pick up too. Officers were permitted to wear something closer to that of the Stamm or parent regiment, so note the grey trousers, his collet instead of Litewka, as worn by the men, featuring red turnbacks on the tails, the more typical calfskin knapsack, and the gold crescent on his epaulets. The waist sash was supposedly forbidden, but many seem to have worn them anyway. A good number of different flag designs seem to have been carried by Landwehr regiments, up to, and in some cases even beyond the AKO of 30th of September 1813 that banned their use. GMB design's my top pick for Prussian flags. For Landwehr there are at least 10 different designs to choose from, based on records of common patterns, including some tied to individual provinces, plus other more generic choices, like a black Landwehrkreuz on a white background, and the reverse. Should you be focusing on later battles, or simply want to avoid flags for whatever reason, then Perry sell a separate Landwehr command pack without standards as well, in both the regular and stiffened cap options. And finally we have our musician. Summerfield's book on the line infantry describes the decoration on the two hoops of the drums as being in white and provincial facing colours, and I've seen illustrations of drummers from Silesian regiments with yellow stripes on the drums, but one commenter recently suggested that these would always be red, which aligns with most of the illustrations out there, so take your pick. I've gone for red here. The design itself on the drum is often shown in this triangular pattern for Landwehr, pointing downwards on the hoop at the top of the drum, and upwards on the hoop at the bottom of the drum. Some musicians may have worn swallow nests on their shoulders as well, but their use wasn't authorised, and neither musician in the Perry pack is sculpted with them, so that saves one fiddly bit to paint at least. And then last we have some alternative sculpts I'd mentioned earlier. I must be honest, having gone through the process of painting them up, and now seeing them finished, the Warlord ones have grown on me quite a bit. The pose is still pretty awkward compared to the Perry metals, but then I suppose the stance is rather in keeping for the ragtag bunch of militia in tatty clothes, clogs and bare feet that they're meant to represent. Incidentally, I have a sneaking suspicion that this caricature of the Berlin Landsturm, reproduced in Hofschroe's book on the Prussian Reserve, militia and irregular troops, was a big inspiration for the sculpts. The face of the chap in wireframe glasses at the front, and this bloke look rather familiar indeed. As is typical for plastic sculpts, some of the details are a lot less pronounced than on the metals. The buttons in particular are really tiny on these, but the sculpting's of a good quality overall. For comparison, the weapons in particular are a lot more detailed than the ones featured in the Wargames Atlantic Reservist set, with a mix of different musket styles being discernible across the models as well, which is a nice touch that I wasn't expecting. As I mentioned earlier, the Schirmmutter are nicely done as well, with the cockade sculpted under the Landwehrkreuz, and the faint Stegen on the sides as well, that you can pick out in facing colour or leave as you choose. Ranked up on a base, this is what the Perry figures look like. I'm doing the typical old school 15mm frontage per figure here, so it's 8 minis on a 60x40mm base, with 4 of these to the battalion. And for comparison, this is what they'd look like with the Warlord figures swapped in. Noticeably taller than the Perry command, but then they are stood to attention rather than marching. Nothing that can't be fixed during basing. Like with my reservists, that you will have seen previously on the channel, I'm toying with the idea of using a mix of plastic and metals within each base of the battalion, just for some more variety and to lower the costs and weight a bit. I'll see if that works. I've mentioned them already in the video, but my main sources used in preparing this guide include Richard Knörtel's Handbuch der Uniformkunde, Stephen Summerfield's Prussian Landwehr of the Napoleonic Wars, Peter Hofschroe's Prussian Reserve Militia and Irregular Troops, 1806 to 1815, and David Nash, The Prussian Army 1808 to 15. Let me know what you think of this format, with everything rolled into one video. It's how I imagine I'll end up producing my guides for the cavalry as well, since there are fewer inconsistencies and quirks of individual regiments to discuss with those, than in the case of the line and reserve infantry. But then again, this is the Prussian army, so who knows. Good luck with all your hobbying, and until next time.